Oftentimes in my life working in TV, you come across a player and you have to font him. For those who aren't familiar with how that works or what that term means, a font is a name bar that appears on the screen when a player is shown on camera. For example, if you see Connor McDavid today, after the morning skate, you'll see Connor McDavid, and underneath 9 goals, 12 assists, plus 5 rating. That's easy, right? Every now and then, not exactly actually, no, every now and then, you'll come across a well-decorated player for an alumni game or something like that, and you have to font him. I'd go blank. The legends for me were always the hardest. What do you do for Bobby Orr? 2 Stanley Cups, his point totals? That just doesn't do it justice. How about Wayne Gretzky? All-time leader in points? Yeah, that works. But most of the time your producer would tell you just to leave it. Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Orr, Maurice Richard. Trying to put something under that, trying to give it context would just take away from the bigger picture. And that's, for me, how it kind of works with Johnny Bower. His charitable contributions, his availability to the public, are part and parcel of, with what he did on the ice, which was remarkable. His background as a hockey player, for those that don't know, stellar goalie with the Cleveland Barons in the AHL, won the Stanley Cup 4 times with the Maple Leafs when he was in his late 30s and early 40s, almost his mid-40s, which is unthinkable to think about when you consider it happened in the 60s. He was a 2-time Vezina winner, and he was ranked the seventh greatest Maple Leaf recently in the top 100. I think it was the Century team that came out 2 years ago. Of course, he made famous the poke check. I never saw Johnny Bower play, like many of us. He retired over a decade before I was born, but what stands out to me is the authentic reaction he elicited whenever he was in public, especially at a Leaf game, when he was shown on the screen, on the Jumbotron, and introduced by the PA announcer. The crowd would show true emotion, probably made all that much more pronounced by all the manufactured elements presented throughout the night that usually go along with a pro game these days. After his death last Christmas, there was a public tribute in early January at the Air Canada Centre, now the Scotiabank Arena. You could see people in the stands that afternoon that you might not see at a Leaf game. They probably stopped going to those games a long time ago, priced out perhaps. Real fans, some might call them, who grew up watching games at Maple Leaf Gardens, possibly watching Johnny Bower. And at the end of the ceremony, when they wheeled Bower's casket out through the tunnel, spontaneously they erupted in a chant of "Go Leafs Go." And it wasn't prompted; it was genuine, like Johnny Bower. I'm Neil Acharya. This is SportsLit, and I'm pleased to be joined by Nate Sager to discuss Bower, A Legendary Life, written by Dan Robson, formerly of Sportsnet, now The Athletic. Nate, what were your thoughts on this book?
Well, I'm grateful it's coming out. With a figure such as Johnny Bower, I think the sports stars of his vintage, right in the middle of the 20th century, the myths tend to overwhelm the man, like someone who has that kind of name recognition. But at the end of the day, he was, he wasn't just a goaltender. He was a father and a grandfather. I have the good fortune that his namesake and grandson, John Bower III, who's now the athletics director at Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. I guess he just has a thing for Nates that aren't spelled the conventional way. Is a great friend of mine, and having met the family a little, you see the character. But, Johnny Bower from that era when, a sports hero could almost become like this character in a fiction. Johnny Bower was one of those, people like you said, you didn't need an introduction. When you look at sort of the long view of sports in the middle of the 20th century, I always think there's a great parallels between him and the Yankees catcher Yogi Berra.
Sure,
they were both the backbone of dynastic teams that right at the point, and Dan mentions this in the book, when television began to take over the delivery of sports to mass audiences. One was a catcher, one was a goalie. Those positions in sports, you really require a certain kind of personality, a certain disposition in order to be successful. Both of them were guys who, grew up in the Depression, and that led to, leaving the formal education system very early in life. But they were obviously both very smart and sensitive, and had a high degree of emotional intelligence too. But I think where the deviation is, Yogi Berra, I think, said it best, right? I didn't say everything I said. Kind of every goofy ball player story kind of got attributed to Yogi Berra. I think Red Smith said it best once. Yogi Berra was just this kind of grumpy guy, grumpy New Jersey businessman whose humor was kind of invented by Joe Garagiola. But with Johnny Bower, it was the fact that he was the genuine article, this down-to-earth pro athlete. Oh, actually, I'll share this one story. I didn't, when John III was getting married in October 2014, I was too tongue-tied. I was like, what do you say to Johnny Bower? He's sitting in front of me in the pew at this non-denominational chapel at Concordia University in the West End of Montreal. And it's a Saturday afternoon, so needless to say, the wedding party got caught up in traffic. We're all sort of sitting there, and it's a warm day in October. And Johnny Bower and Nancy Bower, who's obviously almost the co-protagonist in this book, they're sitting there, and at the time, I guess Johnny Bower would have been just shy of his 90th birthday. And it's pretty warm in this building. It's not air conditioned. And Johnny Bower goes, I'm feeling a little bit thirsty. And the justice of the peace is standing there and goes, well, I think there might be some holy water in the back. And Johnny Bower takes this long pause and goes, better sprinkle it on the Leafs. So
what year was this?
This is in 2014.
Yes.
It turned out it was actually the anniversary of Johnny Bower's first game with the Maple Leafs, October 11th. So he was this, sort of down-to-earth guy. I always think of that one commercial he was in. I think it was maybe for like Bell Express View or something. And it's just him in front of the gray screen with like his ball cap on. He's just like, don't blame me if you can't find enough hockey on TV. I had 37 shutouts. And it was like done in this sort of like anti-comedy way, like those old Leon's Furniture commercials.
Right.
So he's like, who else could he have got to do that? Who else would have been able to just carry off this deadpan delivery? But anyway, something that, Dan really shows rather than tell throughout this book is it's really about how John and Nancy Bower made a life and created a great family together. And Johnny Bower really worked to just not be that type of public figure that people only saw through his TV persona. I don't know if that's doable with the obligations and the schedules that pro athletes are on right now, but I think it really captured what it was like to be a sort of a family man in that era. Found myself hearkening back a lot to Steve Rushin, the Sports Illustrated writer, his memoir, Stingray Afternoons, about growing up in Minnesota in the 1960s and 70s and how hard his dad worked to just try to have the kind of, so he could have the kind of family that he wasn't able to have himself growing up. I think that's something that comes across in this book. And obviously there was, it's a very, you learn a lot of things about Johnny Bower's life that he, that probably didn't come across in all the media coverage of his life. Whether all the things that Dan found out in the book made his job easier or harder, I guess that's for him to say when we talk about Bower, A Legendary Life, this new book from HarperCollins Canada.
Absolutely, Nate. I'm looking forward to having Dan on for a number of reasons, and he'll be in shortly. One of the big ones is not related to the book. It's last time we had some audio issues. This time we won't have those issues, so we'll hear Dan in perfect audio. You will hear Dan in perfect audio on your car speakers or wherever you're listening to this. And just a little bit of background on Dan. He's the author/co-author of 4 bestsellers, including last year, Killer, My Life in Hockey with Doug Gilmore, which we had him on the show for. Quinn, Life of a Hockey Legend. And this book, that's just to name a few. He has a couple of others. And this book will certainly be his 5th bestseller. I've already heard comments when I've had it in my hand. Most people will say, oh, what's that? And then they say, I can't wait to give this to my dad, or I'd love to give that to my dad, or my dad would love this book. That's usually the response I've gotten. So without further ado, let's bring in Dan Robson. We're back on SportsLit. Nate, we have a guest that we're familiar with. We had him on last year. His name is Dan Robson. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You are the author of a new book on Johnny Bower. So I'll ask you right off the bat. You, like so many of us, never saw Johnny Bower play. But what compelled you to write this book?
Good question. Like you said, I was far too young to ever watch a Toronto Maple Leafs Stanley Cup win or watch Johnny play in net. But I grew up knowing the legend of him very well. For me, it started actually, I think a lot of hockey fans will have had some interaction with what Johnny Bower became after his playing days. For me, it was a painting that my aunt gave me when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. I was a goalie and sort of getting into the game, and she gave me this print of a painting of Johnny. It was like, I forget what number it was, up on 1967, of course. There was that many prints of it, and he had signed on it. He had signed it to Danny in the silver pen, and to me, it just felt like it was the most touching thing to receive something like that. I never had Star sort of acknowledge my presence, even though I hadn't even met him, but it was given to me, and it's actually on my wall in my office right now. So it's something that I sort of carried through all that time, and for me, it was a connection to a game I loved, but to the ongoing, like the history of it, and to where it's heading.
Yeah, and now I think a lot of people, when they think Johnny Bower, they're just like original six, Leafs goalie. They might know the number of Stanley Cups. We don't want to take all the meat off the bone, but when people pick up this book, what do you think? And we don't want to give away too many spoilers, but when people pick this book up, what do you think they're going to be surprised to learn about the life of Johnny Bower?
Well, I think the readers, and I hope the readers will fall into two categories. There'll be the reader who was a Johnny Bower fan or remembers the game or knew of him enough to just really have adored him in some way and want to read about him or find him interesting. I think that reader will find a lot of information about Johnny that people didn't know. So basically his entire life before, when he grew up as Johnny Kishkin, his entire life up until the moment he changed his name when he got back from World War II, I've gone back to sort of retrace and piece together, which is something he kept quite hidden throughout his life. So there's a lot of new information about that. Also, the information about his connection to his family and just what life was like throughout his journey to becoming a legend, what it was like for him as a family man, as a father, as a husband, as a grandfather. I worked really closely with his family on this book. I spent a lot of time with his wife, Nancy. So I think it is a portrait of a legend, but also very much of a beloved man that I hope that people who have a sense of who he was will get to know him better through it. For those who don't know the story of Johnny Bower, I hope that it's sort of a journey, an exploration of a life that is completely astounding. Somebody that sort of has touched so many parts of Canadian history, not just within hockey, but through Canadian history in general, and sort of is in my mind, sort of a sort of this symbol of overcoming so much in the sort of Canadian spirit, and obviously becoming this iconic person. It's sort of a remarkable story. So I think that even within the realm of sports stories, there's people who might know him. Those who don't, I still think it's a journey that they might enjoy.
You talked about the picture you got as one of the catalysts, the picture you got from your aunt with Johnny Bower, which he autographed. You also interviewed Johnny Bower when he was alive for a long-form piece for SportsLit, I believe, right?
Yeah, I've talked to him a couple of times, just one for a story on the greatest Leafs of all time when they were doing sort of a ranking system, and I was assigned Johnny. So it was sort of a longer sort of magazine story just about Johnny today. And then for other stories, a couple of times for contemporary players of his era, I was able to chat with them over the phone.
And did that lead to you wanting to do this as well?
Absolutely. I mean, in speaking with him, we spoke for like an hour one day, and just his engaging personality. He was this lovable man who felt so. He was just so generous with his time and so good at sort of enthralling you with his sort of tales that could kind of make you laugh and smile and stuff. And so that really made me interested in him. I also think it left me with a sense of mystery as well, though, because I spoke to him about why he changed his name, and he was very sort of short, and he got quite defensive about that. And I obviously wasn't going to push him at the time. It wasn't even the point of what we were talking about. I was just interested, and
right.
I could tell that there was stuff in his life that he'd tried to curate to a certain extent. And so as a journalist, I mean, I'm just naturally curious. So that just sort of just interested me.
We're going to get into him changing his name because I really like that part, and I could tell you were very inquisitive about it in the book. There's a lot of the book is dedicated to that. Before that, I want to ask you, in terms of longevity, he obviously played into his, I think it was mid-40s, if I'm not mistaken. What do you attribute his longevity to? And I ask you that because, I don't think nutrition is on the level it is now. he practiced hard. You talked about him practicing hard in the book, and you also bring up his father, James, who lived till he was 87, and I think he was smoking, so he must have had good genes. So is it all good genes? Why was Johnny Bower able to break that mold so early? I mean, the Tom Brady thing.
That's a very good question, and I think it goes back to a number of things. I think for sure there was some sort of abnormal reality to his makeup that made him an exceptional athlete that was able to perform well into his 40s. And I mean, he didn't even perform in the NHL until he was 34 years old. And I think what we saw, there's something within him for sure that made him just one of the best athletes. Punch Imlach said a number of times in articles I read that he believed that Johnny was the best athlete in the world at the time. It was obviously somewhat hyperbolic, but it was. If you saw some footage of what Johnny did, if you saw him stopping 60 saves and diving for shots and just being this incredibly agile man at that age, there's some credence to that. You can think, you know what, he actually was a remarkable athlete. Also, he had a remarkable will, and I think that plays a lot into it. I don't think it's all just physicality. He overcame a lot, which is in the book, previously to getting there. And one of the things, like throughout the time he was playing, he also had arthritis in his hands, and he played this entire 2 careers essentially, one in the minors, then one in the NHL, like full careers for most people, with very painful arthritis in his hands. So I think it was a mix for Johnny of will and of an abnormal ability to play the game.
Speaking of the arthritis, was that common knowledge? Because I didn't know about that, and it was very interesting how he found out at a very young age. He was training for combat in, I think, England during World War II, and then got diagnosed with arthritis before he ever was Johnny Bower, the hockey player that we know. That's a hard thing for anybody, let alone a hockey player in that era.
He wasn't even Johnny Bower literally at the time.
Yes.
He was Johnny Kishkin at the time, and it wasn't widely known because he didn't really like to complain about it. There were a few articles, like I read most articles I could about Johnny, and there was mention of it early on in his career, but it wasn't something he continually went back to. He discussed it in his earlier autobiography to a certain extent. I accessed his military records for this book, and within that I was able to sort of get the actual description of what was happening in his hands when he was at war, and which sent him home and frankly saved him from combat, which might be one of the reasons why we were able to have a legend like Johnny in our life. He was a war veteran, but he was sent home because of this terrible arthritis. In the records, it's really interesting because he immediately, when he gets back, though, is back on the ice at least in Saskatoon right away, and starring in the newspaper as a sort of, he gets back on and starts playing, and he's playing despite the fact that his hands, and this isn't just sort of a sort of an old tale he told. There was a medical record of what happened to him. Later on in his career, he then had his hands, he'd deal with it by having his hands wrapped extra tight. And he'd often stop the puck by just knocking it down with his glove instead of, and he was criticized for it sometimes for not having good rebound control. But I think he just found a way, and not a lot of people really knew what he was going through the entire time he was being the star he was.
On that note, Dan, last time you were here, we gave you 2 mugs as a gift. We have a couple of gifts for you today, but I wanted to give you this one right now.
Thank you.
So, if you maybe you could tell our readers what that is. That's
lovely! It's a donation.
Donation to the Arthritis Society of Canada in your name, but my address, because I have no idea how to do that correctly. So
it's a charitable. It's a receipt for income tax purposes.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Yes. So tell your accountant you might want that address changed, but that's a donation to the Arthritis Society of Canada in your name.
That's good
because I figured it was appropriate.
It was. Thank you very much.
No problem. There's more coming. Don't worry,
Okay.
Nate.
Yeah. Now, what went into what I found out coming back to when I was reading this, Dan, was many years ago. I think Stephen Brunt had his Bobby Orr book, and I remember talking to the editor, and she's like, "Well, he writes like about a Canada that doesn't exist anymore, where there wasn't a lot of opportunity for hockey players." And I'm like, I've never really heard anyone describe the original 6 era that way. There's what went into you finding the right lens to capture John and Nancy Bower's life from the time they met on a golf course in Saskatchewan through the, 69 years that they were together?
It's a good question. I think in terms of a lens, I wanted to write this story from the inside out. So I wanted to come to it not from a person who knew, read about Johnny and knew he was in the Hall of Fame, read his plaque there, sort of knew the basics of it. I wanted to sort of come in from the beginning and say, who knew this man the best, and how do we understand his life that way? How do we understand what motivated him and how he got to where he was? So the lens really was connecting with Nancy and his kids right away, and then coming back out from it, understanding how he created the life that we now think of as legendary, how they together in many ways set out in a journey that was unlikely and somehow managed to overcome so many obstacles to become the person that we saw honored and mourned last year in a way that touched people differently than most people ever will and most hockey players ever will. This wasn't just a loss of a guy who used to play the game. It was like a loss of a guy who had connected with Canadians in a way that few people do.
And I just wonder, in all the time you spent with Nancy Bauer, was there one story she told that just made you went like, I can't believe that this happened, and they, are just telling me this?
Well, there's, it's interesting. She just, I'm trying to think of a good story that really shocked me. It was mostly, we laughed a lot. So there was a lot of times when I just got the sense of what their home life was like and how she'd, there's one story about how he got got a puck in the face and she woke up next to him. Not next to him. There's a pool of blood on the bed beside her, and then she found basically Johnny downstairs trying to mend himself after when he was in the minors and been hit by an errant puck in Pittsburgh, and he just basically lost all his teeth. And just learning about how poor the medical attention was at the time really shocked me. So there was a lot of great stories like that and good detail that she really injected into the book.
Sorry, Dan, did we cut you off there?
No, go ahead.
Well, speaking of that, we were going to get you to read that part of the book. So you'll see that there's a green dot, and over into the next page after that. Could you read that for us? And that's exactly about just like they do on late night talk shows and introduce the clip. This is exactly what Dan was just describing about a scene in Cleveland during the AHL days when Johnny Bauer came back from a road trip after being hit in the mouth and Nancy's reaction.
Okay, so this is chapter 7 called The China Wall. Nancy Bauer woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling downstairs in the kitchen. She looked over to her husband's side of the bed. He was gone, but his pillow was drenched with blood. Panicked, she rushed down the stairs to the kitchen, where she found Johnny struggling to tend to the terrible wound that had split above his lip. Nancy had seen her husband carry many cuts and bruises home from games he played. He'd had his nose broken a few times and been knocked out now and then. It was commonplace for Johnny to come home with a lump or a cut on his face. Team trainers often kept leeches to place on lumps and bring down the swelling. Up to that point in his career, Johnny had already lost 8 teeth. It was always scariest when an injury was close to an eye or the mouth. This was by far the worst she'd seen. Earlier that evening, in late January 1953, Nancy had been at their house in Cleveland listening to the live broadcast as the Barons played the Hornets 2.5 hours away in Pittsburgh. She'd heard reports that Johnny was down on the ice after taking a shot in the face. The puck fired by the Hornets' John McClellan smacked him directly in the mouth. He was nearly knocked unconscious by the blow. The impact drove his teeth through his flesh. It knocked out a four-tooth bridge he already had in his mouth. A pivot tooth broke. Another front bridge was shattered. One anchor tooth was knocked out, and another was cracked. One of the broken teeth exposed a nerve. The game slammed to a worried halt. Pittsburgh's goalie Gil Mayer rushed across the ice to see if Johnny was okay and helped him with first aid when Bauer was taken to the locker room. Dr. Philip Foe, the Pittsburgh team physician, said it was the worst injury to a goaltender he'd ever treated. To Foe's shock, Johnny asked the doctor to let him continue the game. Dr. Foe refused. Plastic surgery was needed to repair his damaged lip. A Barons front office worker, Flor Perai, had come in from the stands to get dressed and finish the game. It was one of the game's quirks that a team employee would take over a net if a goalie was hurt. The cost of keeping a second goalie was deemed too expensive, so the Barons' promotional manager would have to do. To Paris's credit, he did sometimes practice with the team, but the single goalie system remains one of the most illogical rules in the game's history. Back in Cleveland, Nancy was still waiting for the news on the radio. She hoped the team would have the sense to take Johnny to a hospital in Pittsburgh. When Nancy got a call saying her husband was traveling home on the team bus that night, she was incredulous. She waited and waited for him to arrive. Hours later, when he finally walked in the door, Johnny held a filthy-looking towel to his face, covered in blood. "Didn't they do anything for you?" she asked. The doctor had cleaned up the wound, bandaged it, and given Johnny an anesthetic to freeze up the pain. Nancy had tried to get Johnny to go to the hospital, but it was already late, and he planned to get checked out in the morning. She had packed up some ice for him to put on the wound, but now, in the middle of the night, his pillow was drenched in blood, and her husband was puttering around the kitchen trying to mend his own face. "That's it. We're going to the hospital." At 3 a.m., she took her husband to get his face fixed. The next morning, Nancy got a call from team management asking why she'd taken Bauer to the hospital. He never should have come home on the bus, she said. He was bleeding so bad. Nancy was told she should have taken Johnny to the hospital affiliated with the Barons instead of the closest one to their house. "Well," she said, "that's just too damn bad."
I love it. There's a lot of extrapolations upon that I want to bring up. I guess the first thing is he had a lifelong friendship with Gordie Howe, which you discussed or wrote about. And I thought also the idea of strong women, and Nancy comes across obviously as a strong woman. Colleen Howe as well. That particular line there too, where she just stands up to team management. I mean, at that time, that probably wasn't a common thing, I'm imagining.
No, it wasn't. I mean,
it wasn't even common for a player to stand up like to management back then.
And I think it's a very good thing to pull out of it. I mean, you mentioned Colleen Howe, who was a famously strong wife in the game and meant a lot to the game because of the way that she stood up to management. Right. Nancy, I think, was Johnny's protector in many ways. I mean, Johnny was the kind of guy who would mend his own face if he had to. I think about having an exposed nerve there and all your teeth basically knocked out, and this coming home on the bus with the team. I mean, Johnny was sort of just, he was just happy to be there, and he came home and said, "Yeah, I'm tough to deal with it." But Nancy kind of called out the BS to a certain extent and wasn't going to put up with it. And I know, when I met her and we spent some good time together, I saw that kind of fiery wit. I mean, right. I could picture her when she was explaining that story to me. I could see her sort of saying it at that time, and she was the matriarch of the family that kept everything in line, as so many wives of these hockey players were, especially through that era. I think it's she's a great example of that.
So how much of this book is really her book?
That's a good question. I think from the moment that they meet, it becomes, I would say it's their book, and then she, I hope, is given a sort of a voice, and that she definitely played a part in sharing her perspective on their lives. And I don't think a lot of the time stories aren't told from that perspective. So we were able to see what it's like at home when Johnny's away on the road for a couple of weeks at a time, right. And taking all of their kids to their different sporting events and supporting them. And I don't think Nancy would want it to be about her because she's a very humble person, but I think it's the story of their legendary life together, not just what Johnny accomplished, but what they accomplished. And she didn't set out for it to be that in telling me the story, but that's sort of what comes through, I think, in that she was a remarkable woman as well and played a big role in all of this. Just, I guess, digressing,
we know of Johnny as, the lovable grandpa-like figure, the 4 Stanley Cups he played into middle age. But you go back and also, as you should, you go into how he broke into the league with the Rangers. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you, we don't really hear a lot about, I'm sure there's people out there that probably don't even know he played for the Rangers. They probably think straight from Cleveland to the Leafs. What I would ask you is, who is Charlie Rayner, and how is he significant in terms of what Johnny became famous for?
So Charlie Rayner was a Rangers goalie that was sort of a star and a veteran right before Johnny arrived, but in New York City. So he was a Rangers goalie, and he was there sort of as a veteran coach, sort of personality that was still with the team when Johnny arrived. And he's basically the guy who taught Johnny Bauer how to poke check. So what became the Johnny Bauer poke check, and what we all know of it, I think most hockey fans today, even if they never even saw it, know that Johnny Bauer is famous for his daring poke checks on breakaways, and often when a player was cutting in from the corner and a defenseman was closing in, so basically adding that pressure more and taking that aggressive attack at players. Johnny became known for it, but Charlie was the one who recommended it to him and worked with him in practice, poking pucks away over and over and over again, getting sort of that lightning fast reflex down on that action. So really, it all goes back to him. And Johnny had given credit many times, but he's sort of one of those figures that's forgotten in history, but it was sort of passed on through Charlie to Johnny.
And it's kind of cool, too, and you wrote about this. I mean, they had a quote-unquote goaltending coach, which was not common, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Johnny later on in life became a goaltending coach for the Leafs when he kind of never retired and always stayed in Toronto, and he became this sort of one of the first goaltending coaches at that time. But it was definitely abnormal, especially in the time when you don't even have a spare goalie.
Right.
To have a goalie hanging around as your goaltending coach was something special, and it was something Johnny appreciated and obviously benefited from greatly.
Well, let's go back to some of your previous books. And you talked about injuries earlier. I started thinking about Clint Malarchuk sewing up his own face. But in terms of this book, I guess what from your past work was the most relatable? And I'm imagining the Pat Quinn book because it was posthumous.
Yeah.
Was that of the previous books you've written? And you can explain to our listeners some of the previous work you've done. Was there anything relatable from some of the previous work, perhaps the Pat Quinn book, that you used in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in every experience of going back and writing about a life in depth like this, there's things I've learned along the way that I think definitely helped inform what I was doing in this process. Previous books I had written, originally, the first book I wrote was with Clint Malarchuk it's called The Crazy Game, and it's about his horrible injury in which he nearly died on the ice and then suffered from debilitating reality of depression and OCD and PTSD afterwards. It was a very heavy book about mental health and taking care of yourself and his ability to get through it. So that was sort of a heavy start. And then I worked on a fun book of baseball with Buck Martinez, and then I had a book on Pat Quinn.
Right.
And Pat Quinn, I think that biography that came after he passed was most similar to the process of what I was doing with Johnny, also similar to the era in that we know Pat Quinn is a legendary coach, but he was also a player who sort of operated. He was a little bit after Johnny, but they crossed paths in the NHL. But also the experience of Pat growing up in Hamilton in a very poor climate and sort of creating his own opportunity, very directly parallels what Johnny did and what Johnny was able to do. And so I found that sort of they're two snapshots of Canadian life from different parts of Canada at different times in Canada. But what I hope I was able to explore was their journey through the Canadian experience.
In the fact, though, that both of them had passed, was there a different way of writing this than, let's say, with the Gilmore or Malarchuk book?
Yeah, I work, in both cases, the first place I went was to his friends and family, the people that knew him the most, and at the same time, there are people who are recently mourning the loss of someone they deeply love. So the challenge was very similar, but the process of working, as I said earlier, from the inside out in that capacity was the same.
Johnny died on, I think officially it's listed as Boxing Day of last year.
Yes.
So were you already in the process of this book at that point, or did it? When did the idea arise to do it, and how soon after his passing did you start on it?
The idea of the book actually started before Johnny died, but it didn't officially become a thing until after he passed. But I remember I was at a book signing for the Doug Gilmore book I had written with Doug called Killer, and I was talking with my publisher just at the event in Toronto, and I had said, I think there's a book to be written about Johnny Bauer. I was someone I admired, and I had always thought there was more to his life than sort of what I had read. So we had that discussion, and then obviously sort of the holidays came, and then Johnny passed, and I thought, that's obviously it was very unfortunate, and I just thought it would have been great to have gotten to work with him on something like that. And then then the publisher came back and said, remember that discussion? Like maybe there is something there. Maybe there is something we can do. So we decided to go from it at that point.
Now I think it's interesting in terms of the timing. There's a Curtis Joseph biography out at the same time.
Yeah.
You have the same publisher.
Yes.
How do they juggle that? You have two lead goalie books out at the same time.
Well, I think that if you're I don't want this book just to be for like Leaf fans, but I think if you're a real Leaf fan, you look at these are two different eras in the game in your team, and so Johnny and Curtis actually interacted. Curtis was a student at Johnny's goalie school in Mississauga in his early career, so they actually interacted and they had great respect for each other. And Johnny had talked about how much he loved Curtis, so there is sort of a generational sort of connection between the two. I think in the sense that the Curtis's book is a memoir. It's a great book, and it's him revealing a lot about his life for the first time. And I think it's for sort of a different style. In this case, it's a different kind of read and a different process. And I think it tells a different story, but about similar topics.
I think you remind me of something John's grandson, John III, told me. I think when the Air Canada Centre opened, when Curtis Joseph was playing for the Leafs, they just automatically gave Johnny Bauer a seat at the end. The Leafs defend each in the first and third periods.
Oh, yeah.
That's
great.
Has your, just, I guess, going bigger picture here, not specifically about this book, you've written a lot about hockey. I mean, how has your appreciation of hockey changed over time based on all these books and all these different people you've covered in the game?
Yeah, I think my appreciation of the history of the game has changed over time. I mean, I wouldn't say that I am a hockey historian. I don't come from this as sort of from a place of being sort of this all-knowing, oracle of hockey knowledge from the past. But for me, it's always an exploration. I am interested in history in general. I'm interested in history of all kinds of sports, like baseball, and I get drawn into that kind of story. And I think so. For me, even within a book about like Doug Gilmour, writing about him, it's an era I remember as a child watching him play, and I remember quite fondly. To explore that from the perspective of the person who lived it was a fascinating journey for me as a journalist and as a writer. So I don't know if it's necessarily just hockey. I mean, I love hockey, obviously, but I think in terms of getting to explore interesting stories from different angles, it's still, it excites me.
Well, I think that's what the best work comes from, people that attack these stories from a broader perspective. And I can sense that in the book. It wasn't just a hagiography of Johnny Bauer. You went to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, so take us through.
And I think that's important. I mean, Johnny's a man I respect a great deal, and I wanted it to be a very honest portrait of Johnny, and I wanted it to be something that sort of looked at, a journalistic perspective of this life that everyone adored. So after, obviously, as I said, my first step was working with his family to be able to get the real stories of his life. I went to Prince Albert, where he grew up, and tried to piece together what his boyhood was like. Because his boyhood was actually a part of his life that he talked about sort of in sort of folksy stories about, like really funny stories about what happened. But there was also a sense of mystery that I think helped create the kind of family man that he was and create the kind of person that he was. All of that, I mean, I think was true of most people, but it was certainly true of Johnny, was formed in those years growing up through the Great Depression in Prince Albert. So going back and retracing where he would have first skated in oversized skates and learning where he would have played sandlot baseball and everything like that, learning where he lived and where he was baptized, that was all very important to me.
And so how long did you spend out there?
I was there for just like 3 days or something like that. I worked very closely with a guy named Ken Guido, who was great, who was from the Prince Albert Historical Society, who I have to give a stick tap to in terms of their attempts to preserve the history of their wonderful city. That means a lot to Canadian history, especially Saskatchewan history. And he helped me work through the archives of historical information that they have, and then also I drove around with him so I could understand the streets a little bit better. Understand, okay, so Johnny lived here, which was now a drug paraphernalia shop, but that's where his house was. How would he have got to school? How would he have walked to school? Where would he have gone to the movies? So we traced their path, and I sort of had him as a guide to sort of show me, because he knows the area. He grew up there as well, and so he was able to show me everything.
Certainly that was a very compelling part of the book, because it allows you to understand, the reader to understand a little bit more about his boyhood. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with all that, all the time, sort of the family, how do you, let that trust factor work for you and not against you. Because I know this probably comes with experience, but I can imagine being like, so many times I've written about someone and I'm just like, oh man, like they told me all this, and I'm worried I'm going to screw something up.
Yeah, I mean, I take I think there's a great responsibility in being honest as a writer, but also being sort of fair and being careful. And I think that initially, everybody always, especially if it's their story or the story of someone they loved, is reticent to put it in someone else's hands and to have them share it because we don't really know how it will be formed. But I think in this story, well, I discuss Johnny's relationship with his estranged brother and his relationship with his mother and the divorce that his family went through, which is stuff that he never really spoke about and was quite private about. For me, I try to do it with a great deal of respect, but same with the overarching mission of I want to understand Johnny as a journalist, and that is a fundamental part of, I believe, of elements of his life that came later. So I sort of from the start said I'm going to go out and write this book. Honestly, and I think at the end it still is a portrait of a quite remarkable life. So
he was great friends. We talked about with Gordie Howe. He was also great friends with the chief George Armstrong. From all the things I've read about George Armstrong in the past, especially from authors, is that he's impossible to get an interview with. Yeah. How did you get into? I think you were at his house, the way it was described, if I'm not mistaken. And it was brief. I could tell from the quotes, it wasn't as though he was probably sitting there talking to you for 2 hours, or maybe he was. But how did you get to talk to George Armstrong?
So it's actually it's actually a phone conversation.
Okay.
But it was good. George was great. I actually spoke to him for about 50 minutes.
Okay.
So we had a great chat, but. It was actually the first day I'd met with Cindy and Barbara Bauer, who are Johnny's daughters, who were incredible people who helped a great deal with this book in a Tim Hortons in Georgetown. So of all places, obviously I'm meeting Johnny Bauer's family in Tim Hortons, and sort of it's the most Canadian thing I could possibly ever be doing. And then I looked down at my phone and I missed a call from George Armstrong. So like this is just like wow, this is my most Canadian moment. And then so I go to the parking lot after a conversation and I call him back and he answers the phone and he tells me he doesn't want to. He's calling me to let me know that he's not going to talk to me for the book. And I said okay, like I really obviously respect you calling me, and he's a lovely man that was so kind to have done that. And then we just started talking for about 50 minutes about Johnny. So I would record every conversation. I wasn't going to use it without his permission, so we recorded it. We had this great conversation, which was very vulnerable, and I think it showed a lot about what Johnny meant to his teammates, especially a guy like George. And so I later on then circled back and spoke through his family and to George via them, and then he agreed to be part of the book. So I was very gracious for his support and help with that.
Were you aware initially when you first tried to get a hold of him that he doesn't talk, or is that a myth? Maybe he does talk.
No, he doesn't talk very often. No, and he's very reticent to go to public appearances and sort of be out there. So I know I was aware. I had. In getting his contact information, I was informed, it's not likely that you're going to. I went through his son, who helped me get to him, and he said, like, I don't know if my father's going to chat with you, and that's just, that's his sort of prerogative. But it was that he called, and then when we spoke, what I gleaned from it was that he wanted to talk about Johnny because Johnny was like a brother to him, which he talks about in the book, and I think the chapter that we talk about is called Brothers,
right? And
it was something that meant a lot to him. Johnny's passing hurt him a lot, and it was. I think he wanted to talk about it, and so I think in the end, like, well, I understand why he doesn't sort of want to, get out there and talk. I think, it meant a lot that I was able to share that, and I had the permission to do that.
Speaking of brothers, another very touching part of the book is Bob Bond, who I think you might have been with him.
I was, yes.
And so, in that part where Bob Bond actually kind of gets emotional. Does he not? Does he not shed some tears?
I watched a big sort of crocodile tear, and it was really emotional for me. Actually, we had a good chat over coffee at his house, and he was very open and raw and honest about what Johnny meant to him, and it wasn't sort of. See, one of the things that I try not to do too much in a book like this is rehash the stories that people have already heard, or the typical sport stories, like, yeah, Johnny was this, and he was a great guy, and he's always last off the ice, and that kind of stuff. There's that. That's necessary, but you want to try and get to the emotional part of it.
Right.
And with Bob, he was just emotional right away because he missed Johnny. He was with Johnny before he passed, like in his last event where they were signing autographs, which is such a part of Johnny's legacy. But he was waiting to the very end, signing everything, and Bob had said, you don't have to do this, we got to go. And Johnny was saying, it harkens back to his quote and his philosophy that it's a privilege, not a right, which is now on the Leafs locker room wall, which is something that was carried after he passed away.
Right.
And for Bob, it was he was missing his friend, and it was a real honor for me to talk to him about that, because in many ways they're sort of they're the posters, the old photographs, or the old stories of Bob winning the Stanley Cup and the broken leg and everything, but to see them in I think this real human reaction as friends and brothers meant a lot to me.
Now, obviously, what were the editorial discussions like with how to handle the whole? I guess there are myriad theories about why John Kishkin became Johnny Bauer after he started his career. It's almost like Rashomon, but I want to hear you tell it.
So yeah, there's a whole the chapter in the book that's about that. What's in a name is that was. So as a journalist, I'm driven by like mysteries, and I want to know what I can't know, and I want to find this out. So that was something that was obviously, as you mentioned, sort of throughout the book, the theme of names and what names mean, I think is really strong. It begins and ends with the concept of a name, and I think I meant that intentionally, in that I think there's so much wrapped into that. And so for what I found, though, when I started writing the book, was that Johnny had told so many stories about his name, and so many stories had come up that clearly could not be true, that I thought there's such a mystery to this. So for example, on his Wikipedia page, I think it might still be there, there's a reference to his last name being Bauer name, coming from his mother's maiden name.
Right.
That's actually attributed to me on SportsNet, because in the story I wrote, he told me that. And I have it, and so I go back and I've tried to change it many times on Wikipedia, and it keeps getting changed back. And I'm like, no, I know the truth now. But that wasn't true. And so then when I found all these, and they also had told the story that he'd been adopted. He told the story, there had been several ones, and he told his family that he just picked the name out of a book. But why Bauer? Why specifically Bauer? And then as I kept asking more questions, more and more stories came up. And so the way I have to deal with this is that inevitably we'll never fully know where the name came from. And I'm okay with that, and that's fine, because I think that's part of the legend that Johnny created for himself. And so I spoke with one of his nephew and Prince Albert, who sort of helped me through that, who gave me a very strong lesson in how stories evolve, and sometimes how they're full of crap, and sometimes how they might be full of elements of truth.
Any ideas as to why he may have changed his name, and perhaps it ties into his backstory of his dad was an immigrant from the Ukraine?
Yeah. So one of them, his sister Anne Batting, who just turned 100 on Saturday, actually.
Happy birthday, Anne.
She's the last surviving sibling. As far as
Again, we talked about genetics earlier.
Yeah. And so she sort of discussed theories, and I think that one of the main ones was that his last name, Kishkin, is an Eastern European name. His father had come from what was now known as the Ukraine. At the time, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he came over, and there was sort of there was a prejudice, frankly, towards people of Eastern European descent at that time. I didn't really know about this, frankly. I didn't really know, and it was especially after World War I. And so one of the theories was that the barons had said, your name's too European, is not English enough. We need to check. We're going to change your name, because if you're going to be a star, you need to change your name to something different. And so that's the theory that she'd been told and that she carried on.
Yeah, and that was something that did happen in sports a lot these
Yes.
days. I think it was Johnny Pesky, the Red Sox infielder, around the same time.
Yes.
His real name was Paskovich, but they
Yes.
just made him change it to Pesky.
Yeah, and there's other names, like there's a real poetry to the name Johnny Bauer. So there's sort of like it's symmetrical. Like you look at the cover of the book, and it covers the book, and it really is.
Right.
I think it's a perfect name, and so I kind of became a little bit obsessed with it, because I wanted to know how he found the name. So I was going through records trying to find Bauer families at the time, like where he find it. There was one rumor that didn't get into the books. They didn't find it credible enough, but that there would have been like a famous comedian in Cleveland at the time that he might have like learned, like watched. And to me, it was just an intriguing mystery to follow. But it was also, I found his name was misspelled a lot. And that's, and I think the very beginning of the book opens with a misspelling of his name, and it carries on the first priest who baptized him, confirming his age, which was in question for a long period of time, misspelled his name, and then it was misspelled again and again and again. So there is a definite legitimacy to that idea.
Kelly Rudy had a book that came out recently. I think it was last April, maybe even last April, I think, and you just talk about the persecution of Eastern Europeans. I think his parents or grandparents were interned like the Japanese Canadians were during, and I had no idea that there's a Hungarian name, I think. So, I thought of that, and I also thought, Dan, you watched the Maple Leafs in the 80s, right?
In the 90s more. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering, were you aware of the Gem Line? Do you know who the Gem Line was?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So it was Ed Olczyk, and it was Gary Lehman, and there was also a guy on that line named Mark Osipovich.
Okay.
Mark Osipovich, his grandparents were Ukrainian immigrants, and his dad changed his last name to Osborne. So Mark Osborne is Mark Osipovich. So I thought,
that. I was like, that doesn't sound familiar. Osborne, okay.
But I
that's
thought
interesting.
I thought of that too, because his dad changed his name, I think, because he was working in the banking sector and wanted to fit in. But that could very reasonably be a reason why Johnny changed his.
I think, and generally, in most cases, it's most likely the most obvious reason, and so I agree with that 100%, and I think that sort of obviously some names are changed, some weren't throughout. Johnny, the one thing that made me question it to a certain extent was the stories Johnny told about it, that he never actually settled on one. Later on, he sort of would settle on, but when I spoke to him, he'd sort of talk about how he'd hint that there was a breakup in the family, and that's why I changed my name. So he always hinted that there was something more to it.
Right.
And to me, that sort of left the question lingering, where it wasn't just settled on the name was difficult or the name wasn't English enough or wasn't play enough. There was something personally that had affected him that made him separate his childhood and his youth from his adulthood.
There's an underlying story of I guess the immigrant experience to this book, and I was going to ask you about that, but also could you expand on his fractured relationship with his mother? Yeah,
so Johnny, I think like many people I think of his vintage are very issues like divorce and family breakups are very complicated, difficult things, especially in a small town like Prince Albert. So Johnny's father and mother, both very young immigrants from Eastern Europe that met in the area and homesteads, married young and had 9 children, so several children, but they broke up at a certain point. And Johnny never really discussed that in depth because she ended up being remarried. And these are things that are today you kind of go, this happens all the time. It's not that big of a deal, but it was a big deal in the family. I know in speaking with Anne, his sister, and speaking with other relatives, that this was something that fractured the family deeply, and it affected Johnny's relationship with his mother for the rest of their lives.
And the immigrant story?
Yeah, so the immigrant story was fascinating for me to look into because I didn't really know about this, but Johnny's father comes over through Rotterdam. He takes the boat across he's an Eastern European who finds his way to America, and then eventually finds his way through the promotion of homesteads at the time, which is it's a sort of a history lesson I learned in grade 10, and it's sort of like I passed over, and then I realized how incredible that really was. Like these young men and women that were going out into this sort of unknown landscape and farming, in some cases very harsh conditions. The prairies are not the easiest place.
Probably in a lot of cases.
Yeah, in a lot of cases. And in Johnny's case, because in Johnny's father's case, he got there late. It was like a very sandy area that wasn't. So there was no money to be made, and just like sort of, I was able to get his homestead record. So getting the details of what he had on the farm, the log cabin he built, and then what they did before they moved on. But that was all sort of fascinating to me because it was the beginning of this legend. It was the beginning of this life that was such a calming painting experience, but also a painting experience that I don't think people fully appreciate.
Yeah, you're taking me back to when I was a teenager and I was doing work for my dad at a farm, and this farm wife was in her 80s. It's like, there were no good old days. How much do you hope people get that from the book without thinking you're tearing down iconography?
I hope that people kind of I just hope people appreciate it more. I mean, I think when I look at it, I think I didn't appreciate the experience, and so when I learned about it and became really interested in it, I want that interest to come off and for people to read about it and think, this isn't just about sort of Johnny put on hockey skates, he was a good hockey player, he watched Hockey Night in Canada, he became a star. It's really about the family circumstances he lived within, the economic circumstances he lived within, and the experience that forged who he became that helped him become a star. And I think that that's not just the story of a hockey legend, it's the story of a lot of our grandparents and great-grandparents.
This is your 5th book, correct?
This is my 5th, yeah.
So can we travel back and let's take the journey from Dan Robson, undergrad at Queen's, to where you went to Carleton after?
Yes.
And so how does a writer, Dan Robson, land his first book and end up with 5 to this point?
Well, the Coles notes is, yes, I went to Carleton, I studied to be Queen's, studied to be a teacher there, and then went off to Carleton to study journalism. And then out of journalism, I was an intern, as you always are, and then at the Toronto Star. I went to SportsLit magazine from there, which is where I got to start writing long-form features and really explore writing in a deeper capacity.
Right.
And through that, after a couple of years there, of writing stories that I think, I was always interested in stories that aren't just about sport.
Right.
I got into it from a sort of long-form journalist ideology from the start. Even when I was at a newspaper and the Canadian Press, etc., I always wanted to write magazine stories.
Right.
So I wrote a story about Clint Malarchuk, and he opened up his life after this horrible accident, and that turned into a book. And then from there, I had more opportunities to continue on.
Did you find it? From just judging from a lot of the other authors I talked to, it seems like certain athletes, the publisher will just want that name to be sold as a book and find an author to attach the story to. Do you, coming from a journalism angle, do you find it's harder to do the publications come to you and say, hey, Dan, because I'm certain some of these guys probably don't want their story told in that way.
Yeah.
In the real way.
It's interesting. Like with a guy like Clint, for example, that story had to be told in the most raw, real way, because Clint was he's a famous name to a certain extent, but not really a name that people are waiting for that book to come out. You really had to show that there was a lot more to the story than hockey, and it was something that a lot of people could connect with. So that we had sold that to HarperCollins, our publisher, and we had to sort of say this is what it's about. Beyond that, I've had opportunities where they would say, we're working on this book, we'd like you to work with with Buck Martinez, for example, who I love that experience so much. It was a baseball book, but I was able to be a complete nerdy baseball guy listening to all these old time stories. So it was a lot of fun. But then with Quinn, that offer came like right after Malarchuk came out. And it was actually Penguin Random House, and they came to me and said, and they're fantastic, and they said, we think you're a writer that can handle this. We'd like to write a full biography of Pat. And that was a huge opportunity, and I'm so grateful for it, but it was a frightening, terrifying thing, because all of a sudden I was jumping up from writing a book. First of all, I had just written a book for the first time, and then writing a biography, which was it was my own words, it was my own journalism. I mean, everything is my own journalism, but it's when it's a with book, when it's a ghostwritten book, quote unquote, it's it's a collaboration. It's sort of a memoir kind of thing. In these cases, it's sort of all on me. So that was my first dive into that, and it was a bit frightening.
Yeah, how much time does it take to sort of decompress once you finish the actual project?
I'm still decompressing for this one. It's interesting, actually. I don't realize it, because I always tend to just jump into the next project. And this time I did find myself somewhat mentally exhausted. And certainly last time, for a variety of reasons, I was finishing up 2 books, and just through going through personal stuff, it was it's sort of a numbing time. So you kind of come through and you realize what it takes from you when you're just kind of living within a fascinating story, but a very specific story nonstop for a short period of time. When you come up for air, you realize that you're a bit stunned.
Speaking of new opportunities, which you mentioned just previous to getting into this, you got a new role with The Athletic.
Yeah. So yeah.
Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I officially started last Monday. So I left SportsLit, where I was a senior writer for 7 years, which gave me every opportunity I had when I talked about writing books and all these opportunities. They were lovely, and I'm so grateful for that time. But The Athletic, this sort of site that's been obviously growing and doing great journalism, had the opportunity to join them as a senior writer and head of features, where I'll be doing long-form investigative and feature work across Canada with a sort of Canadian focus, but I'm hopefully working with the team to build some great Canadian journalism out of that. So it's an exciting opportunity for me.
Certainly is for all the writers out there, and I think you're taking submissions, or at least
Yes.
to bring people on. Correct.
So we're always looking for people who are eager to tell great stories.
Do you have to get out of here?
No, I'm fine.
I thought you had Nate. Do you have any questions?
I just wondered, I was throwing this out, when you were, and I always say readers make writers, what were some of those favorite sports biographies that you've read?
That's great. That's true. There's a lot, and I would say, like, I don't want to be too obvious off the top, but Open by Andre
great
Agassi,
book.
when you read that book set the bar for sport memoir, and I made the mistake of reading that before I read the Electric's book, and so you go, well, I can't possibly do this, and if that's the bar, then, but that's not the bar. I mean, that's the ceiling. Like, that's an incredible book where you can't really reach that. But that book, and then just I've read, going back to Ken Jarn's The Game, Stephen Brunt's Searching for Bobby Orr. There's a lot, a lot of David Halberson's work. Just to sort of, I have a wide collection at home, and so to think of one that was sort of seminal to what I do would be difficult. But it's definitely reading is the most part of my writing, I guess is the best way to put that.
What's the? You said you're decompressing right now, so you're gonna go to The Athletic and start your thing there. But what's next? Last time you were here, you told us after the fact, because you couldn't say it on the mic, that you're going to do the Bauer book. So is there anything you can't tell us about right now that you want to?
No, I can tell. I have another project on the go right now. It's not a sports project though, so it's a bit different. I'm writing a sort of a memoir about my father passed away when I was writing Quinn, so that was sort of a difficult experience that sort of derailed my life for a little bit.
Right.
And it's still obviously not derailed, but the track just kind of went a different direction, and it's been a tough journey since. So that I'm writing a book about my relationship with my father, and he by trade was a construction guy. He built houses and then created his own company, and I'm learning sort of who he was through the skills that he did. So I've been working on that with Penguin Random House, and that book will come out in March 2020. So I'm sort of decompressing and working on that.
Very cool. And I just want to say in tribute to your father, I was thinking about that because last time we had you read from your Gilmore book, and you had that memory of going to the games with him. And every time I pulled this book out, I pulled it out on the train to go to Kingston this weekend, and even before that when I had this book, everyone said, I can't wait to give this to my dad. So I thought you would like that.
I do appreciate that. That means a lot. I know my dad would have liked to have read it too.
I am going to give you, last time we gave you 2 mugs. So here's something to put into those mugs. I was in Kingston this weekend, and you spent some time in Kingston, right?
I did.
Well,
yes, many good years in Kingston.
Well, there's Kingston
nice.
beers here.
Thank you.
Both made in Kingston.
Skeleton Park.
Skeleton Park.
That's
it's a haunted beer. You drink that and you start seeing ghosts.
Are there any bones in it?
There might be.
That's a real Kingston insider.
Skeleton Park.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Hey, no problem. Nate, is there anything you wanted to ask before? And of course, if you want to add anything, feel free.
No, but I just kind of wish you got some McKinnon brothers. But I guess
I put it back. I told you. I had it by hand, but it's made in Bath.
It's made in Bath.
Those are both made
2
in
miles
Kingston.
south of my parents' house, so we wanted to stay on brand with the Kingston.
You gotta stay on brand.
They got a nice plug out of it still, so that's good.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Anything you'd like to add?
No, I think with this book, I really hope that that people read it, and I do hope that they that it's a story that can captivate them. That's what I set out to do as a writer. It's not, in my mind, I didn't set out just to sort of rehash Johnny Bauer stories. One of the when someone posted it on Facebook, sometimes someone said, "Well, everything's already been said about Johnny. Like, why would I buy this book?" And I guess my point is, that's, first of all, that's not true.
Right.
Second of all, well, because I hope that it's a story that I've told in a way that can captivate you and maybe teach you something about, like life and family and stuff like that.
And I mean, this no bullshit. That's 100% what I took from this too. I mean, this book could have been exactly what we know about Johnny Bauer, and I thought there was a lot of great nuggets and a lot of romance to it, and weaving different types of elements and narratives that make it a fantastic read. So check it out, folks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on.